Good afternoon, everyone. Authors at Google New York is pleased today to welcome Howard Friedman. Howard Friedman is a statistician, health economist, writer, and artist currently employed at the United Nations Population Fund and is an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University. He is here with us today to discuss his latest book, The Measure of a Nation: How to Regain America's Competitive Edge and Boost Our Global Standing. He has a master's in statistics and a PhD in biomedical engineering from Johns Hopkins University. Please welcome Howard Friedman.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Google, for hosting today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody. The book itself is based on this premise of competitive intelligence, and I think people at Google are well aware of the idea of competitive intelligence. Using data to compare yourself to other, in your case, companies. I'm sure there's a lot of analysis that goes on here looking at other competitors in the search space or advertising or in the social media space. So it's a very common business practice. What's not so common is for the United States to use the same principles to compare themselves to other countries, see how they're doing, and then use that data to identify opportunities for improvement as well as to identify areas where they're excelling and they can leverage their advantages. So the premise behind the book is taking that basic concept that's used regularly in the business world and applying it to the political space. Seems straightforward. Of course, there's going to be some challenges. At the end of my talk, I'm going to explain what are some of the key challenges, but before we even get to that, it's worth putting one thing on the table right away, which is the whole idea of American exceptionalism. The first objection that a lot of people have to the idea of using competitive intelligence for the United States is simply the idea that America can't be compared to any country, that we're exceptional, so different that there's nothing to be learned from the rest of the world. Now, obviously, that's a very problematic attitude. It's an attitude that rests in the idea of blissful ignorance. It prevents you from learning, and it doesn't just seem arrogant, it is arrogant. So this whole idea of American exceptionalism and removing ourselves from the ability to compare to other countries, we're just going to have to take that and put it away because that defeats the whole opportunity for learning. With that said, we then want to ask ourselves the question of competitive intelligence. Who are we competing against? And that's where we do have to recognize that the United States is different from other wealthy countries in some respects. There's no other wealthy country that has the size population of the United States. If you look at other countries that have large populations, they're not as wealthy. And other wealthy countries aren't as populous. We have to accept that as just the reality of the number of data points that exist for countries. Nonetheless, what we did for the book is identify wealthy countries, that is those who had a GDP per capita of over 20,000, and large in the sense of having a population over 10 million. The 10 million threshold selects the 1/3 largest countries by population, and it also requires that country to have a population larger than New York City, our largest city. It's not perfect, but it's a good enough criteria to allow us to do the rest of the conversation, to examine these other countries. So we have that identified, and after we pass through those two filters, what we find is that there are 14 countries remaining that have data. The 14 countries generally are populated in Western Europe. Additionally, there's Canada, the United States, South Korea, Japan, and Australia. Intuitively, these are the countries that you would expect to compare to the United States because they have similar levels of socioeconomic quality. They have similar abilities for infrastructure. So we have our competition. But then what are we comparing with? What are the factors we're looking at? In the book, I focused on a few areas: health, education, safety, democracy, and equality. Those 5 areas. Why those 5? Well, first, they are fundamental to having a successful society. They're critical. They overlap with a lot of the key areas in social science that have been built up on the idea of societies, from Maslow's hierarchy of needs to Amartya Sen's models. More importantly, from my perspective, and I think everyone here at Google could appreciate it, there's data. And it's generally very rich data, so we can analyze it and draw conclusions, versus picking subjects where it's not quantified. So we have those 5 subjects. In today's discussion, I'm going to focus on 3 of them. I'm not going to spend too much time on health. I think people have heard so much about it between the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act discussion and some of the key facts that have been already discussed very much in the media. And safety has been so much out and about, especially in the last few weeks with the unfortunate shooting. So I'm going to mention a few quick facts about that, and then I'm going to move to the other 3 topics, which I think are going to be very interesting, and we'll see how they're all interconnected. The whole basis of the book uses 3 principles, which are fairly straightforward. The first one is, if you compare the United States to other wealthy countries, we're quite different. Now, that's an obvious statement, and one that anyone who's traveled outside the United States has probably come to appreciate. But many Americans don't travel outside the United States, and so they don't recognize how different we are. From a quantifiable point of view, it's not just that we're different, but the second point is we're not always the best. And then the third point, which is pretty logical from the first 2, is, and when we're not always the best, let's see what we can learn from other countries. So 3 basic principles. With that in mind, I'm going to introduce just a couple quick facts for you in health and safety, and then I'm going to focus on the other topics. So in health, the key fact that I would want people to walk away from is just the idea that the United States spends 2 to sometimes 5 times more on health than other wealthy countries, and we have the lowest life expectancy. So we're spending far more, and our primary outcome for health, which is life or death, we do the worst on. So we have a terrible return on investment. We're going to take that fact, we're going to just put it aside. We might come back to it, we might not. Safety, I'm going to introduce just a couple quick facts, and then we'll move on to the other topics. For safety, key things to keep in mind about the United States is we're a much more dangerous country than the competitors, than these other wealthy countries. Our murder rate is more than twice, and in some cases, 10 times more than the other countries that I compared with. These other wealthy countries are much safer in the sense that you're far less likely to be murdered. And then the flip side of the whole idea of risk is then the question of incarceration. And in incarceration, we see a similar difference in that we see the United States incarcerates roughly 3 and sometimes 10 times more than other countries. An incredible incarceration rate, one that is almost at the same scale that the Soviet Union had during the Gulag days. So we have this very different world in the United States with regard to our internal safety. Let's take those facts, let's put them aside for now, and let's focus on the other 3 topics that I think are really interesting. Democracy, education, and equality. First, I'll talk a little bit about democracy because, of course, we have the excitement with the upcoming presidential elections. When we think about democracy, there's lots of ways you can compare 2 different democracies. One of the most common ways you do it is you look at the question of competition and participation. Competition refers to not just how competitive are the elections, but also people's ability to voice themselves in government. And then, of course, the participation is very simple. That's voter turnout. When you combine those metrics, what you find is that the United States does very poorly. We have the lowest voter turnout of any of the comparator countries. Now, that alone is a symptom of a democracy in trouble. Besides the voter turnout being so low, we have another situation. The situation is our structure of elections is very different from other wealthy countries. Let me explain that a little bit. What we have in many of our elections is called a single-seat, winner-take-all election. Let's say you're voting for someone who's in the House of Representatives. You have your vote, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Green Party, whichever party you're from, and you choose to vote for your candidate. The candidate that gets the highest percent of votes goes to Washington. Meanwhile, everyone who voted for another party, their vote basically got ignored. What do you have in the rest of the world? Well, 38 of the 41 largest democracies in the world use proportional representation. A very simple idea. Let the distribution of representatives, the parties that are represented, reflect the voting distribution. So if 40% of the people voted Democrat and 45 voted Republican and 5 voted Libertarian, then the representatives would be that same distribution. Why is this a big deal? It's a huge deal. It's a huge deal because with this single seat winner-take-all method that we use and almost no other country generally uses, we have a few problems. We have the problem of gerrymandering. We create these very strange diagrams of what a county looks like, and then that seeks to isolate. It minimizes the voices of other parties, and it allows you to lock in seats. Gerrymandering leads to something else, which is extremism. Politicians who know that they're in a Republican district or in a Democrat district know they could be as radical as they want and get reelected. They don't need to communicate to the entire people who are in their district. They only need to communicate to their party. And so it drives the parties farther and farther apart. There are lots of other issues as well. But from the point of view of competitive intelligence, the key thing to recognize is our method of electing officials is different from what's done in most of the world. Not only is it different, but it's not so good. So why do we have it? Well, we developed our democracy more than 200 years ago. We were at the cutting edge. We were a leader in the world. But we haven't evolved our systems. The rest of the world has improved its technology of voting, whereas we're using basically the same system from over 200 years ago. The analogy in the Google world would be if you were programming with punch cards. Wish you luck. So, moral of the story is, we have a system that is antiquated, and we're not updating it using the latest technology for democracy. And it's not such recent technology. This has been around for many, many, many decades. So we have that whole idea of proportional representation. On other comparisons that are done, for instance, the World Bank does a nice comparison of democracies, what they've seen is other countries, such as Australia, rank very well. What does Australia do that's different from the United States? They have this great idea. It's called preferential voting. Instead of going into the voting booth and me picking my candidate, and let's say I do like the idea of a third party, in the United States, if I pick that third party, I'm basically throwing my vote in the garbage pail, unfortunately, because of that winner-take-all. In Australia, you rank order your candidates. This is my favorite, this is my second favorite, this is my third favorite, and you just go down the list. If no candidate gets a majority, the candidate who got the least amount of votes, they reallocate based on what the second choice was. And they keep doing that until a candidate has a majority. Makes perfect sense. Works very well in Australia. Works in some other countries as well. The United States, we can adopt it. It's a great example of using a better method of voting. So we have those two areas where we can improve. Of course, we have the other thing we have to keep in mind. The United States is one of the only countries that has 2 steps: register, then vote. Most wealthy countries, the government takes an active role in making sure that anyone who files taxes or has a driver's license or does any involvement with the government officially is already pre-registered to vote. So you don't have this 2-step process. Other countries are trying to enable their voters, whereas we see there's a very active process in the United States to keep people from being able to vote. We're creating higher and higher bars for people to jump over to vote, whereas in other countries, it's a much simpler process for you to vote. And that impacts our voter turnout. Lastly, on democracy, I was just going to mention 2 quick things. Back to the idea of us using an old system. The first thing that I want to mention is there is no other wealthy country where if you live in the capital, you don't get a voting representative in Congress. This is only in the United States. Washington, D.C. residents, they have no voting representative in Congress. Is there any logical reason for it? Absolutely not. When they wrote the Constitution, it wasn't a perfect document. And there were things that had to be improved. In this particular case, what's preventing D.C. from having a voting representative? partisan politics, nothing more. Meanwhile, the rest of the world looks at the United States on that particular issue and they laugh, because we are telling the rest of the world that we are a shining example of democracy, yet citizens in our capital don't even have a voting representative in their legislation. The last thing I was going to mention is the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a system that, well, let's just say, has not been impersonated by any other country in the world. Many countries have identified our separation of powers as being an excellent idea, and they've adopted it to their usage. Many countries have admired the structure of our Constitution, the way it was framed, and they've modified it, but they've used that as a model. No country has looked at our Electoral College and said, that's a great idea, I've got to take it. And the reason why they don't do that is because it's one of the most anti-democratic institutes you could possibly imagine. I'm just going to mention two specific things about it being highly undemocratic. The first one is, we're here in New York. And if you're in New York or California or Texas, the number of representatives per resident is much, much lower than if you live in a low population state. If you're in Wyoming, for instance. So in the Electoral College and in voting for the president, what that says is people in Wyoming are much more important than people who live in New York or California or Texas. It's not one person, one vote. It's not even close. It's off by often a factor of 3. Now that's a huge disparity with no logical justification. All you need to do is use the popular vote. It's not complicated. Many countries do it. It's very straightforward. And we do vote, so they could easily count the popular vote. I don't actually expect that the Electoral College is going to get torn apart anytime soon, so we'll talk about a realistic solution to that. But the other thing that's worth mentioning is the Electoral College and its general process of all or nothing voting is also what creates this crazy system of swing states. And think about a swing state for a second. In the 2008 election, the Obama campaign spent roughly $20,000 with advertising in Illinois. And they spent about $40 million in Pennsylvania. These states have roughly the same population. They have almost exactly the same number of representatives. But if you lived in Illinois, he wasn't going to waste any money bothering to advertise or reach out to that state. Why? Because he knows he's going to, quote unquote, win the state. And then everyone in that state, it'll appear as if they supported Obama, even though a very large percentage didn't. Meanwhile, Pennsylvania, a swing state, those citizens are much, much more important. And so depending on where you happen to have registered to say that you're living, you're a much more important citizen, or you basically have no voice at all. So we have these two symptoms, very obvious symptoms, of a problem in our democracy. With the Electoral College, we're not going to see it disappear anytime soon, but Maine and Nebraska have already done a simple solution. They allocate their electors based on voting. They use proportional representation. Trivial idea. You don't have to have it all or none. It's not required. Every state could simply implement that rule, and you would not have disconnects between the popular vote and the electoral vote. Simple solution, using that best practice of proportional representation. Let's take those ideas of democracy, we'll put them aside for now, and let's focus on education. Education is a really interesting topic because it's another area where the data show very clearly that the United States was the world leader, and we've declined a lot. And when I say we used to be the world leader, what I mean is we used to have the highest rate of college education in the world. Now we're out of the top 15. We were an innovator in providing free primary and secondary education to everyone, universal access to it. An innovator in that, and with our GI Bill, we really led the forefront of encouraging people to go to college. We've slipped behind, and we can see that slipping behind at all levels of education. Our rate of pre-primary school is average to below average compared to other wealthy countries. And there's a huge disparity in who goes to pre-primary education. Children from middle-class families have a 20% higher likelihood of going to pre-primary school than children from poorer families. 20% difference based on who your parents are. So we see we're behind at the youngest levels and that there's a huge gap. As people age, they reach high school. Our rate of secondary education graduation went from 10% in the early 1900s to the 70-ish range. And it did that around the 1970s. And it's leveled off ever since. We have not improved. Compared to other countries, we have about an average rate of secondary school graduation. But what about the quality of the education? There are these great cross-country exams. There's PISA, there's PIMS. And if you look at some of these cross-country exams, it tells us that the United States, on areas of science and math, for instance, tend to do slightly below average. The top countries, countries like Korea, Japan, and Canada, do extremely well. The United States, somewhere around here. But then we get these disparities. Children from wealthier neighborhoods do extremely well on these exams. In fact, they would outperform any country. Whereas children from poorer neighborhoods do much worse than any of the wealthy countries. This separation based on the wealth of your family is a very important factor. Now, that would be true in any country, but the relationship between how well you do on these high school exams and the social economic class of your family is more important in the United States than any other wealthy country. They've looked at the relationship between socioeconomic class and performance on these PISA scores, and what they see is that the United States has a far higher dependence than any other country taking the exam. That's a problem we're going to get back to when we start talking about equality. Going further up, we see tertiary education. We have an above average rate, and we'd like to continue to do that. Now, it's not all bad. We do have a real wonderful competitive advantage in the United States. We have some of the highest quality colleges, universities, and graduate schools in the world. It's a competitive advantage, and we need to keep that competitive advantage in the back of our mind because we need to leverage competitive advantages and at the same time correct for issues that are going on in other parts of society. Let's take that excellence for a second from Korea and drill down into it. The data is very consistent. Korea does outstanding in education from the high school level and the tertiary educational level. So what are the things that they're doing in Korea that we could learn from? Well, let's start with the basics. Number of days of school. In the United States, we don't have a national requirement. It's state level. But there's a huge variation, and we roughly spend about 180 days of school at primary and secondary level. In South Korea, 220 days. Roughly 40 days more of school. In 40 more days of school, you can learn a lot. But additionally, it's the structure of when you take your time off. They don't have that incredibly long summer break where we all remember, or we all recall forgetting everything that we had learned up to May, June, and then showed up back at September, and you had to catch up. So the length of school year, that's just an obvious example, and there's a very strong correlation, over 85% between length of school and the score on these cross-country exams. So increasing the length of school, very obvious step, but not a silver bullet. What's more important is focusing on the strategy that they've used in Korea that's worked very well. They recruit the top students to become primary school teachers. Only the top students are eligible to do that very important role in society. And then they get paid very well. Primary school teachers in South Korea get paid roughly twice the GDP per capita. In the United States, roughly GDP per capita. So in South Korea, it's a well-paid position, very selective who can get into it. They also add a lot of ongoing job training to improve the skill set. So they invest in their teachers. And they have very low turnover rates, roughly 1% per year. The United States, unfortunately these days, roughly half the people who go into education graduated from the bottom third of their class. We don't pay teachers well, roughly GDP per capita. If you go back about 40 years ago, we used to give it a much higher rate. About 40 years ago in the United States, we paid roughly 175% of GDP per capita. Teachers used to be well paid, and it used to draw some of the top talent in the United States. So here, we're not drawing the top talent, we're not paying them well, it doesn't get the prestige that it does in many other countries, and our turnover rates consequently are much higher. The other thing to keep in mind is how we fund our education. About 90% of the money for public education in the United States comes from local sources. That is, your local government, your state government. The federal government has very little influence on it. What does that mean? Well, that has a big difference, because if you grew up in a poorer neighborhood and the money that's being raised for your school is coming from your neighborhood, you have far less money per student than if you grew up in a wealthier neighborhood in the United States. That disparity has huge implications. The quality of the learning facilities are worse. You have less availability of quality textbooks, computers, and the salaries that you pay teachers tends to be much lower. So, the wealthier neighborhoods, they have far more money to spend on education, better learning facilities. Everything is quite strong there. And they draw the best teachers, the most experienced teachers, because they pay more. And the students who have to go to the poorer schools, worse learning facilities, worse opportunities for learning, and they end up with usually the least experienced teachers. A terrible cycle for students who already started out with a lower rate of pre-primary education, and then their learning opportunities are worse. No Child Left Behind originally had two components to it. One was this aggressive testing of students to see how much they're learning. The other one was an aggressive monitoring of the students' opportunity for learning, the quality of the facilities, of the education that's available to them. They dropped one of them, and that was a mistake. They need to monitor both. Now, that last example I gave, it's another example of where the United States is very different. Other countries, there's a much stronger role for the federal government in education, very much about equilibrating the opportunities. And we've seen that there are certain advantages to that. We have a separation of federal and state powers, and we're not going to get away from that, and I'm not advising that. But what I am advising is we should learn from what goes on in other countries in terms of giving equality of opportunity. Children from the poorest neighborhood should not have the worst opportunities for learning. They shouldn't suffer because of the fact that they grew up in a poorer neighborhood. We're going to take all that information about education and we're going to put it aside for a second because it brings up the whole idea of equality. We've seen it come up a few times already, but it's going to come up explicitly right now. And when I say equality, there's so many ways of measuring it. We have income inequality. We all know what income is. You have pre-tax, post-tax income. And that's an outcome measure. When we talk about income inequality, one of the things that we'll see is the United States has a far higher rate of income inequality than other wealthy countries. Well, income over time, over years and over generations, leads to wealth. And it's not surprising that knowing that we have higher rates of both pre-tax and post-adjustment income inequality, that our wealth inequality is also much higher than other wealthy countries. So we have those two. We have the equality of opportunity. I'm going to spend a bit more time on that later. And then lastly, we have other factors like gender equality, the opportunities for women. And there you can measure it in many ways. In terms of economic opportunities, we're about average. In terms of the political representation of women in legislature, we're very far below average. We don't have the same level of representation. The UK had Margaret Thatcher. We have not had a female president. Things like that. But we're going to focus more of the conversation on equality of opportunity and income inequality to really drive home a point about the disparity between the United States and other countries and decisions that we're making as a culture. If we go back to the idea of income inequality for a second, what we've seen is that the inequality has increased over the past few decades. The pre-tax and the post-tax. The pre-tax inequality has increased for a number of reasons. A lot of them are related to how we structure our corporations, how we pay executives, how we pay people in finance. Our CEO to worker ratio is much higher than other countries, and it has exploded over the past few decades. That explosion has corresponded at the same time to a vast weakening in the strength of unions and a weakening in the voice of shareholders. The owners of companies, shareholders, have virtually no say on how much an executive gets paid. That's a very strange proposition of a business. And in many countries, that's not true. Germany, for instance, there's a much stronger voice that employees have in the compensation of everyone, including the executives. So you have a different structure and you have less extremes of income. Now, you also have another factor that's playing in. A lot of people talk about the drive of globalization forcing higher rates of income inequality. And it's certainly a fact that income from people who are doing manual labor, well, that could potentially now compete with people from other countries, and it could suppress those wages. But at the same time, you have not seen an explosion in salary for people who have a college degree. In fact, it's been completely stagnant for 30 years. Moreover, there are 4 of the 13 comparator countries saw income equality increase, not income inequality. It went the opposite direction. So for those people who say, well, this is just a function of globalization and the United States as a society has no role to play in the increasing inequality, are just denying reality. If that were true, then every country would have seen it go up. Rather, we have these changes in standards and norms and our tax structure. We have moved our tax structure to a point where wealthy people often pay very little in taxes. It's not just the anecdotes that Warren Buffett gives about him paying a lower rate than his secretary. We all have the highly publicized example of Mitt Romney making millions in the last few years and paying a tax rate that is certainly half or less than many people in this room. So that's all in the income inequality, both before and after adjustments. But I really am interested in the equality of opportunity. The equality of opportunity is something that I take very personally because I grew up here in the United States, of course, and we grew up with the American dream. The idea that no matter who you are, where you came from, if you were talented, if you worked hard, you could become anything you wanted to be. And that's still true. You can. But the chances of you moving up socioeconomically in the United States turn out to be far less than other wealthy countries. Now that's a tremendous disconnect. It's a disconnect because intuitively, Americans grow up with the idea that we have more social mobility. We think of European countries as having very class societies. We think we're very mobile socially. It's not true. Here's some data to give you a feel for it. If you look at quintiles, that is, dividing people up into percentiles based on the wealth of their family, the bottom 20% all the way up to the top 20%, people who grew up in the United States in the lowest 20 percentile of wealth, the chances of them moving out of that lowest percentile isn't very good. 42% roughly stay in that lowest quintile. 58% roughly leave. Well, we expect that a certain percentage will stay in the lowest quintile, just by definition. But that's not a very good movement out of that poorest range. What about in other countries? In other countries, roughly high 20s to maybe 30% stay in the lowest, and 70% or more leave. You're more stuck in the lowest quintile in the United States than in other wealthy countries. And what about the true rags to riches story, the Horatio Alger of going from the poorest quintile to the wealthiest? The rate in the United States is lower than in any other wealthy country that's been measured. We have less of a chance of going from that very poor beginning to becoming wealthy than if you grew up in other wealthy countries. Less social mobility. This completely contradicts American intuition. They do these world value surveys. And in these world value surveys, Americans are far more likely to say that their country is a meritocracy than in people in other wealthy countries. We have more confidence in that. Americans are far more likely to believe that people who are poor because of they either did not try hard enough or lack of talent. We blame people for not succeeding more than other countries. With that said, our perspective completely is a disconnect from the reality of the data. Believing that we have more social mobility when in fact we have far less. It's intimately related to our educational system. The disparities in education. The person who grew up in that poor neighborhood, who had a far less chance of going to pre-primary school, which has been shown to be a strong predictor of factors not just like long-term education, but also affecting crime, all the way up to the quality of your high school education and the huge disparity, more dependent on where you came from in terms of your score on that high school exam than in other countries, all the way up to the chances of you going to college. At every road along the way. And college is a huge factor in moving from poor to a wealthier area. Of the people who started in that poorest quintile, if you got a college degree, only 16% stayed there, 1/6. That is, vast majority get out. If you don't get that college degree, nearly 50% will be right back in that same quintile, intergenerational poverty. So education really is a critical factor, and fixing the issues with education, public education from the lowest levels all the way up, is the best way to start addressing it. But it's not just education. I want to leave you with a key thought in this area of equality, which is there are still racial inequalities, there are still gender inequalities that will exist even if we correct for many of the issues regarding education. And the area with racial inequality, here's a powerful fact. An African American and a Caucasian American who both have finished high school, the Caucasian American earns roughly 25% more. African American and a Caucasian American both have finished a college degree. Caucasian American earns roughly 25% more. African American, Caucasian American, both have finished master's degrees. Caucasian American earns roughly 25% more. So education will certainly help, but we still have some pretty clear disparities that we need to address as well. Now, I've taken you with a little bit of a drop into health and a little drop into safety. We've talked a lot about democracy. We've talked a lot about education. We've talked a lot about equality. We've seen that the United States has areas where it needs to improve, areas where it used to be the best, and it's slipped off. Education, we used to be one of the best educated workforces in the world, and we're declining. In health, we used to have one of the top 10 life expectancies in the world. We're far out of the top 10 now. So health, we've comparatively declined. Safety, we've always been a dangerous country, much more so than other countries, and we continue to be so to this day. But our incarceration rate has exploded. It's 3 to 4 times more than it was in the 70s. And that explosion has been based on many of the laws that have been passed. In other areas, in democracy, we were a leader. We were an innovator. With our Constitution, with our Declaration of Independence, we created modern representative democracies that led the world. But we haven't learned lessons that the other world has learned over the last couple hundred years. Better ways to vote, correcting errors in our Constitution. They are errors. We need to correct them. Lastly, in equality, we have this painful disconnect between our belief that we're a wonderful meritocracy and the data, which shows very clearly that we're actually more stuck in where you came from than in any other country. Case in point for that last one is the fact that in the United States, children from poor families who are top performing students have roughly the exact same chance of going to college than the children who are the worst students from wealthy families. Wealth, unfortunately, is trumping talent right now in the United States. We need to correct that. It's not all bad. We have competitive advantages. We have areas that we can use as ways to improve. We have some of the best colleges, universities, and graduate schools in the world. And they draw top talent. They bring them here. What do we need to do? We need to come out with better ways to help them stay. Help them build the future of America. I know Google knows very well this story, so I don't have to retell it regarding your founders. But that's the point about bringing top talent in and enabling them to stay. Besides our educational system at the tertiary level, which draws top talent, we have other advantages. We have some of the best research in the world, not just in medical research, but in technology research as well. companies like Google, leading the world and drawing that top talent in. And we need to bring them in. We also have one of the most friendly business environments in the world. This is a great country to create a new company. And we need to bring those innovators in, those entrepreneurs, draw them and give them an environment where they can stay. Let's take those competitive advantages and use them. We have a tremendous amount of racial and cultural diversity. That's an advantage. It gives us opportunities that many countries don't have. Let's use those. So we have areas that we're lagging behind, areas that we have fallen, where we used to be the best. And we have these wonderful competitive advantages. We need to use them. Well, sounds great. I've heard the data. I've heard about these best practices. Roll forward. We have some barriers to implementation. I'm just going to mention a few of them. The barriers to implementation include lack of awareness. If you talk to most Americans, they will not believe that we're not the best in health. And when they were having all the discussions about the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, the phrase that kept being used was, we have the best health care system out there. And it's just not true. Now, we do have something that's the best. We have the best leading edge health technology in the world. We do have something that's great. But our public health is not so good. And you need to make sure people realize that. Educate them on where we're actually doing. Show them the data. You know, the book that I wrote, Measure of a Nation, it uses data that's easily publicly available. The links are there. You can connect right to all the data and compare the United States. And you'll see in many areas we're not doing so well. So the first part is awareness and showing the data. The second barrier is complacency. Complacency takes many roles. In the United States, we have the reality of we're a wealthy country. We don't generally have people starving in the streets. While our social supports are much lower than other wealthy countries, and that's related to our belief, mistaken belief, in being a meritocracy, we have enough that people are not fighting for survival. And as a result, you don't see the passion in the streets, the changes in the United States, the declining performance in our health system, the declining performance in our education, the declining effectiveness of our democracy has been gradual. And it's almost like the story of the frog in the water. So it's a parable. I don't believe it's actually true. But it's the idea of putting the frog in the water and turning on the heat. And the frog will only notice when it's too late that the water is boiling because the change is gradual. Now, that particular example reigns a little bit true for the United States because we have not seen a switch being flipped. We didn't go from having one of the longest life expectancies in the world and then the year dropping. It was gradual. We didn't go from having the highest rate of tertiary education in the world to dropping out of the top 10. It was gradual. And our democracy did not lose its power to represent over a scale of 1 or 2 years. It's been gradual. So there's the complacency. The other factor is our democracy itself, and that's why I spent some time talking about how we are very different in how we implement our democracy. Our democratic system prevents a lot of change. And we've also seen in a lot of studies that those who are coming from the poorest neighborhoods have almost no influence on legislation. A lot of it's due to how we elect officials as well as the influence of money in politics in the United States. That didn't just start with Citizens United, but it certainly accelerated with Citizens United. So we have all of those influences, things that are holding us back, our political system, complacency, lack of awareness. And the last factor I want to mention is just the reality of our system has worked very well for some groups. Not just some companies who've done very well because of our health system, the for-profit world that isn't seen in other wealthy countries. It's not just our educational system where many areas are benefiting while others are suffering. It's not just in safety where we have for-profit prisons, not a norm, an exception for the rest of the world. But also in our political system. Our two-party system works well if you're in the two parties and if you fundamentally believe in those two parties. But if you have a different opinion, then you're not able to express it. The groups that have benefited from our current system, they will defend their benefits. So for those who want to make change, you want to take that competitive intelligence, that data, you want to leverage that to see Can we apply some of the things that are working well in other parts of the world? Remember, you're going to have to fight the fact that there's a low awareness of data. There's complacency. There's the issues in our democracy itself. And lastly, you're going to have to push against those who are benefiting greatly from our current system. With all that said, it's a fight worth having. It's a fight worth having because we have wonderful advantages here. We have great opportunities to leverage those advantages and improve on the areas that are not doing as well. Why should we? Very simple. Because our country has been great. It deserves to continue to be great. Not just for the next year or two, but for 50 years, 100 years down the road. We need to learn how to improve. Imagine if Google decided tomorrow that they would just stop studying the competitive landscape. They would just ignore everything that's going out there. Any new developments in algorithms, let's pay no attention to it. Any new types of search, any new innovations that are going on in advertising, or any of those, if you decided to just ignore it, well, you wouldn't be around in too many years. For the United States, we can't afford to ignore the lessons that the rest of the world has learned. Rather, we need to learn them so that we can continue to be great over a time scale of 50, 100 years. Thank you very much.
The microphones are open for questions. If anyone has questions, and the book is available for sale up here for $5. John? No questions?
I'm afraid this is more in the way of a comment than a question. Very little, if anything, of what you said was new or news or a surprise. Very little of it was unknown, I suspect, to most people in this audience. There was one theme, though, that I sort of took out an undertone to your general presentation, that we don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. We don't know that everyone else has better health care, that we don't, and therefore we don't have it. That we don't know that everyone else has better democracy, and therefore we don't have it. And while it may be true that many people do not know these things, that's not an accident, and I'm not convinced it's particularly relevant. The problem, as you began to allude to toward the end of your talk, is not that we are ignorant about better systems or ignorant about the problems that exist in healthcare, in safety, in democracy, in education, and other areas. The problem is that this really does, the existing system in the United States really does serve the interests of a small group of people very well, generally the people in power and the people with more money, and continues to do so, and that the system as it exists and as it continues to change toward the direction of greater inequality and so forth, serves the interests of the people in power better. It's not an accident. It's not because we don't know. It's a deliberate process and deliberate efforts to change things in these directions that you don't like and I don't like and probably a lot of other people sitting in the audience today don't like. And in particular, when you talk about we or the United States as a group, you sort of blur the differences here that are really at the heart of the issue, because the United States does not have a problem. Some people in the United States have a problem. Maybe 80% of the people in the United States have a big problem. And the question is not, does the United States have a problem? Is it better or not? The question is, why, how does the 80% organize better to take more control and take more power and take their appropriate share of the resources from the 1%? You can't talk about we, you can't talk about the United States as if it's one thing, because then you completely miss the real problem at issue here.
Okay, so thank you for the comment. I very much appreciate it. I'm going to counterpoint, since it wasn't a question. My counterpoints will be, first, you're saying that, yes, everyone here in the Google audience is well aware of that information. And it's not just because you have your laptops in front and you're checking the facts as I speak. It's you are at one of the most selective companies in the world for recruiting. But I'm talking about a nation of 310 plus million people, and the large percentage of Americans are not aware of these facts. And awareness is a major issue because ultimately we do have voters, and voters who are greater aware are less likely not perfectly unlikely, to vote against their own interests. So
Awareness itself is not an accident.
So I'm gonna continue with my my counterpoint. So there's 4 points I raised, and I agree with you that awareness is one factor, and I listed 4 key barriers. The other one was complacency. The other one was our political process, and I think that there's a lot of agreement with that, but we have to change a lot of the political process itself. The process of electing has to be changed. And then lastly, and that's the point I think you were emphasizing and in agreement with me on, was that those who are benefiting are going to continue to defend their benefits, and they'll continue to take more. And I want to take your point a little bit further because I finished the speech talking about how to leverage our advantages and to recognize our disadvantages. I wanted to finish on kind of a positive on purpose. I would like to tell you my book does that. Doesn't quite. The book takes actually your exact point and it says, what if we don't? And if we don't make changes right now, the trajectory is very clear as well. I want to see these changes happen. I want to see a United States that is robust, not just for the 1 or 2 or 3%, but for the entire country. On the other hand, if we don't, the trajectory is very clear. I've spent a lot of time traveling around the world. We will end up in a world that looks very much like Latin America or an oil economy, where a few percent of the population live in gated communities. They have concierge physicians. They send their children to private school. They do not interact with the rest of the country. And the rest of the country is doing their best just to make ends meet. That's the long-term trajectory if we don't correct, if we don't make changes. I prefer to inspire people on the positive than the negative. As for the idea of using we, as in America, it's a choice. I'm making a conscious choice to focus people, in this case it's focusing Americans, on the idea of a goal of greatness rather than aiming at particular groups who are certainly trying to steer a system to their own advantages and away from others. So I'm making a conscious choice, but I don't disagree with your factual statement. How about that? Other questions?
Dr. Friedman, you spent a lot of time talking about the different comparative benchmarks and ways to compare the United States to other industrialized nations, for lack of a better term for myself. Taking that a step further, if there are other countries, not to be specific, but if there are other comparators that have figured out that the water was starting to boil and have made changes to their constitutions, what can we learn from that process? Is it an Occupy Wall Street? Is it not to divide the United States into different groups, but how do you go to the next meta level? What's the sequel? What's the 2.0 of your book in terms of, okay, if there are things to learn, and we agree to that, how do we now make those changes? And I care less whether it's constitutional amendments or any of that stuff, but from a process standpoint, how do we now learn and actually do that based on what you've seen other nations? Because I have to believe the British Empire figured out a few things they need to throw away, as did the Romans, et cetera. What does our empire need to do based on your comparative analysis?
Okay, so I think we're focusing this question more on the inequality. It's tied to the first comment. So I'll stay away from the health and safety and focus it on that particular point. Well, you can look at other countries. You can look at Brazil, which is a middle-income country, and they made a conscious effort. They zeroed in on this question, and they have made huge differences. But we can stay inside the United States. We saw this rise before. We had this. We had this at the late 1800s, early 1900s. This is where the robber baron era days came from. We had massive inequality that took off. And then we had a counter movement. First, there was Teddy Roosevelt with the trust busting. He didn't just go after the companies. He also aggressively went after income inequality. It came back later. It came back in the progressive movement. And in the progressive movement, what did they do? They instituted increases in the rates of taxation so that it became a much more progressive tax system. They also made other legislative changes. How did those go about? They were popular movements. The people have to care. For any change we're talking about, whether we're talking about the health, the safety, or in this case, focusing on the issue of equality of opportunity, the people have to get out, they have to voice their opinion, they have to make themselves heard. If they stay in their homes and they're complacent, nothing will change. Now, our democracy, unfortunately, right now, does not listen well to the voice of the people, but it does listen enough when millions are out there in the streets. And that seems to be the way America can move forward, because the legislative changes to change how we vote, those take a long time. But people in the streets, there's responses to. Take the Tea Party on one hand. They had passion. They created changes. Whether we agree or disagree with the direction of the changes, they did make changes. Occupy Wall Street, I'm surprised that they didn't get more momentum. And maybe they will come back in full swing in the fall. But you need that passion. You need it at the top of people's agenda in order to implement a difference. Simply having conversations starts the process. But pushing it further to people actively protesting, that's how democracy changes. Thank you.
That's all we have time for. Thank you.
Thank you very much.